never told this story publicly. Not because I don't want to, but because every time I try, I second-guess myself. I start wondering if maybe I misread the situation. Maybe the timing was coincidence. Maybe the explanation is something boring and mundane that I just couldn't see from where I was standing. But then I remember the last transmission, and I stop second-guessing. My name is Dale Whitmore. I'm a retired park communications technician. That's a fancy way of saying I was the guy who made sure all the radios worked, all the repeaters were functional, and that when a ranger called for help, somebody could hear them. I worked for the National Park Service for 19 years, and I spent the last 8 of those years stationed primarily at a park in northern New Mexico. I'll call it the Cimarron Backcountry Sector, which is close enough to the truth without getting me into conversations I'm not ready to have. This was 2017, late October. The leaves were gone and the cold had settled into the canyon walls like something that lived there. I want you to understand what this place feels like before I go any further. There are parts of the American Southwest, real, specific geographical zones, where radio signals don't behave the way they should. It's not folklore, it's documented. Layers of magnetite in the volcanic rock, certain mineral compositions in the soil, the way canyon walls can trap and redirect frequency waves. In our sector, there was a stretch of trail, roughly 4 miles, starting near a dry creek bed and ending at an old fire lookout tower, where communication was unreliable at best and non-existent at worst. Every tech who'd ever worked that area knew it. We called it the quiet stretch, not the zone of silence, but the idea was the same. You go in, you might drop out. You come out, you check in. Standard operating procedure. Any ranger entering that corridor checked in at the entry point, gave an estimated exit time, and checked in again at the other end. If they didn't check in within 30 minutes of their estimated exit time, we initiated a welfare check. Ranger Marcus Delgado had done this exact route probably 60, 70 times. He was 34, fit, experienced, one of those guys who made the wilderness look casual. He'd grown up near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, knew high-altitude terrain like most people know their commute. The route he was running that Tuesday afternoon was a standard patrol. Estimated time through the quiet stretch, 90 minutes. He called in at 2:17 p.m., said conditions were good, trail was clear, slight wind from the north. I logged it, told him to check in by 4:15 latest, and went back to the equipment inventory I was working on. At 4:15, nothing. At 4:30, I tried a radio check. Normal protocol. Static, some feedback, nothing unusual. No response. At 4:45, I flagged it to the duty supervisor, a woman named Carol Brash, who had about as much patience for anything she considered overreaction as she did for slow software. She told me to try again at 5 o'clock and start logging the attempts. I did. Still nothing. Here's where the first thing happened that I couldn't explain. At 5:12 p.m., my console registered a transmission from Marcus's unit. It wasn't voice. It was a carrier signal. Just a blip of open channel, like someone keying a mic and releasing it without speaking. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I responded immediately. "Delgado, this is base. Go ahead." Nothing. I tried 3 more times. Nothing. A carrier signal meant the radio was functioning and someone had activated the transmit key. That meant Marcus, or someone with his radio, was within range of at least partial coverage. The quiet stretch was narrow, maybe a mile wide at the widest point. If he was transmitting, he was close to the edge. But he wasn't coming out, and he wasn't speaking. We sent 2 rangers in from the south end to backtrack his route. I stayed on the console. At 6:40, they found him. He was sitting on a boulder about a quarter mile inside the north exit of the corridor, which meant he'd almost made it through. He was physically fine, no injuries. He had water, he had his gear. He was just sitting there, on that rock, in the dark, staring down the trail toward the south. When they asked him why he hadn't come out, he said something I still think about. He said, "I was waiting for it to stop following me." They brought him back to the station. He was quiet, not distressed, just quiet, like a man who'd made a decision he was still sitting with. He ate dinner. He answered our questions politely. When we asked what had been following him, he said, He didn't want to describe it on record, but that it walked upright, that it stayed at a distance of about 40 yards, and that every time he'd stopped moving, it had stopped moving too. I figured, we all figured, large predator. Mountain lion behavior can be surprisingly mimicry adjacent. They've been known to track hikers for miles, and the way they stop when you stop is documented and eerie when you experience it up close. Marcus had mountain lion encounter training. He knew what to do. We asked why he hadn't activated his emergency locator. He said, "Because I didn't think it was a mountain lion." Then he said something else, very quietly, that I almost didn't catch. He said, "And I didn't want to draw attention to myself by transmitting." I sat with that for a second. "Marcus," I said, "we recorded a carrier signal from your unit at 512. That was you keying your mic." He looked at me. And I want to be specific about this expression because I've replayed it many times since. It wasn't confusion. It was something colder than confusion. It was the look of someone who has just received a piece of information that makes something worse, not better. He said, "I didn't key my mic." We went around on this a few times. He was certain he hadn't touched his radio from the moment he entered the quiet stretch. The discipline of it, he explained, was that in that corridor with unreliable signal, random transmissions could cause feedback issues with the repeater, so experienced personnel often went radio silent until they exited. Standard unofficial practice. He had not keyed his mic. He had not transmitted. I pulled the equipment log. The carrier signal was there, time-stamped, originating from Marcus's unit ID. No one else had been issued that unit. Now, there are explanations for phantom carrier signals. Equipment malfunction, radio frequency interference causing an accidental transmission, a short in the PTT button. I have sat with all of these explanations. I believe all of them are technically possible. What I cannot explain is what the signal seemed to want. Because here's what I keep coming back to, and this is the thing that doesn't let me sleep clean. At 512, when that carrier signal hit my console, I responded. Out loud, over open channel, I said, "Delgado, this is base, go ahead." Giving away my location, my schedule, the fact that I was monitoring. Marcus's theory, and he shared this with me 2 weeks later over coffee after he'd processed everything, was that something in that corridor had learned to use the radio. Not transmit coherently, not speak, but key the mic. Create the signal that produces the response, and then listen. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying Marcus believed it. And Marcus was the most unimaginative, practical, evidence-first person I've worked with in 19 years. He transferred to a desk position the following spring. He told his supervisor it was for family reasons. I ran into him at a conference in Albuquerque about a year later. He seemed fine, normal. We had a beer. Right before we said goodbye, he asked me, almost offhand, whether the carrier signals had continued after he left. I had been hoping he wouldn't ask that. They had. Intermittent, irregular, always from that corridor. Always just the key and release, no voice, no content. Our equipment team checked the repeater twice, found nothing wrong with it. The signals continued through the following winter and then stopped, as far as I know, though I retired in 2019 and can't speak to what's happened since. Marcus nodded when I told him that, like it confirmed something. He never told me what. Tell me in the comments, if you picked up that carrier signal, would you have answered it? Because I've thought about that question for 6 years, and I'm still not sure I gave the right answer. The thing I can't let go of is that she described it before it happened. My name is Brendan Holt. I'm a high school history teacher from Tacoma, Washington, 41 years old. I have 2 daughters, Lydia, who was 8 at the time, and Cass, who was 12. My wife Claire and I took them on a camping trip to the Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic National Park in August of 2021. It was the kind of trip we'd been planning for years, kept delaying, finally made happen because a pandemic had reminded us that time doesn't wait for convenient scheduling. I want to be clear about the kind of man I am before I tell you this. I do not believe in supernatural things. I believe in evidence. I believe in cause and effect. I have a graduate degree. I have voted in every election since I was 18. I coach junior varsity soccer. I am telling you this because what I'm about to describe is not the story of a person who is prone to this kind of thinking. And I need you to understand that the experience changed something in how I see the world. And that change was not welcome, and I did not ask for it. The Hoh rainforest is one of the few temperate rainforests in the continental United States. It gets 12 to 14 feet of rain per year. The canopy is so dense that even in summer, light comes down filtered and strange, greenish, like being underwater. Moss covers everything: the trees, the fallen logs, the ground. Sound behaves differently there. It's absorbed, muffled. You can hear your own footsteps very clearly and very little else. We arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and set up camp at the Hoh campground, which is a proper developed campground with designated sites, bathrooms, bare boxes. We weren't roughing it in any serious sense. Our site was maybe 200 yards from the ranger station. Wednesday night was normal. The girls were excited. We made hot dogs on the camp stove. Lydia fell asleep early. Cass stayed up too late reading by flashlight. Standard family camping behavior. Thursday, we hiked the Hall of Mosses trail in the morning and the Hoh River trail in the afternoon, going in about 4 miles before turning back. Nothing unusual. Beautiful, actually. The kind of day that makes you remember why you do these things. Thursday night is when it started. We were in the tent around 9:30. Claire and I in the middle, a daughter on each side, the way we always sleep when we camp. Lydia was already out. Cass was drowsy. I was reading on my phone. Claire was asleep. Lydia woke up at, I checked my phone, 11:48 p.m. She sat up very suddenly, not gradually, not fumbling out of sleep. She went from flat to sitting in one motion, the way children sometimes do when something in a dream shocks them awake. I put my hand on her back and asked quietly if she was okay. She was awake, eyes open, oriented, not that glazed look kids get when they're sleepwalking. She whispered, "Dad, what's the humming?" I listened. The campground was quiet. Some distant generator from another site, a few insects, the river in the background maybe a quarter mile off. I told her I didn't hear humming. She frowned and said, "It stopped." Then she lay back down and was asleep within 2 minutes. I mentioned it to Claire in the morning. Claire said Lydia sometimes had auditory experiences when she was transitioning between sleep states, a thing she'd read about in a parenting article. Hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, very common in children, nothing to worry about. I accepted this. It made sense. Friday morning, we drove to a trailhead about 7 miles from the main campground, a less trafficked route that a Park Service pamphlet described as offering some of the most isolated old-growth experience in the park. The trail was real, marked, legitimate. We hiked in about 2 miles. That's when I noticed we were not hearing birds. This might not sound like much, but the Hoh rainforest is exceptionally vocal. The range of bird species is significant, and the constant low-level chatter of the canopy is something you stop consciously hearing after an hour, the way you stop hearing air conditioning. When it stopped, what replaced it was a silence that felt less like absence and more like presence. A weight. Claire noticed it too. She looked up. Cass had her earbuds in and didn't notice. Lydia stopped walking. She turned around and looked back down the trail behind us. She looked for maybe 4 or 5 seconds, and then she turned back to me and said, "Dad, do you hear the humming now?" I did not hear humming, but something had changed in the air. I can't describe it better than that. A pressure change, almost. The kind of thing you might attribute to weather if you were indoors. I crouched down to Lydia's level. I asked what the humming sounded like. She thought about it. She said, "Like when you hold your ears and you can hear your heartbeat, but from outside." Claire caught my eye over Lydia's head. She wasn't smiling anymore. We started back to the trailhead. Here's what I need to tell you about the walk back, and I want to be precise because precision matters to me, and I know how this sounds. We were walking normally. Good pace. Cass ahead, me and Claire together, Lydia between us. About a half mile from the trailhead, Lydia reached up and took my hand. She does this sometimes. It's not unusual. But then she squeezed it hard and pulled me to stop. She was looking into the tree line to our left. There was a man standing in the trees. I want to be calm about how I describe this because the most frightening thing about it was how ordinary it almost looked. He was standing about 30 feet off the trail, among the ferns and the mossy roots of an old-growth Sitka spruce. He was wearing dark clothing, green or dark gray, hard to tell in the filtered light. He was standing completely still. I am a tall man. This individual was noticeably taller. He was standing in uneven terrain, partially obscured by the ferns, and his posture was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Not hunched, not aggressive, just wrong in some way that registered before I could process why. I moved Lydia behind me. I called out, loud, clear, the way you're supposed to. Hey, how are you doing? You need any help? No response. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge, just stood there. I pulled out my phone to call the ranger station. No signal. Which was not surprising. We'd had no signal all morning on that trail. I turned to Cass, who had stopped and was looking toward the trees too. I told her in a firm, calm voice to keep walking toward the trailhead. Don't run, just walk. I told Claire the same. I did not take my eyes off that tree line for the full half mile back to the trailhead. I did not see the figure again after we started moving. I don't know if it followed us. I don't know if it moved at all. We got to the car. I drove to the ranger station. I filed a report. The ranger on duty, young woman, professional, took notes, said that while the park did occasionally have issues with unauthorized campers and individuals who were, in her words, in a difficult situation mentally, she wasn't aware of any recent incidents in that specific corridor. She said she'd have a patrol go through. I asked about the area's communication dead zones. She confirmed that trail had poor to non-existent cell and radio coverage due to the terrain and canopy density. Then I asked, almost because I couldn't stop myself, is there any history of unusual activity in that corridor? Sounds, interference, anything like that? She paused, just briefly. Then she said, people sometimes report unusual acoustics in the old-growth sections. The canopy creates some strange effects. She looked back down at her notes. That was the end of that thread of conversation. We left that afternoon. We never talked about it in front of the girls, and Lydia never brought up the humming again. But here's the thing. 6 months later, I was going through old photos from the trip, just scrolling through on my laptop showing Claire, and I came across a picture Cass had taken Thursday morning on the Hall of Mosses trail. We were all in it, posed in front of one of the massive maple trees. Normal vacation photo, smiling, except in the background. Barely visible, maybe 60 yards behind us, at the edge of the trail where it curved. There's a figure standing there. Dark clothing, very still. We had been in the park less than 18 hours at that point. I went back and looked at the timestamps. Cass had taken that photo at 9:47 Thursday morning. Lydia had woken up Thursday night asking about the humming. I don't know what the order of those events means. I don't know what it means that my 8-year-old heard something I couldn't hear. I don't know who or what was standing in those trees. What I know is that I look at pictures from trips differently now. Specifically, I check the backgrounds first. I still don't fully understand what happened to Gary. What I do understand is that it started with a sound, and that by the time I realized what was wrong, I had been listening to it for 4 hours without knowing it. My name is Terrence Okafor. I'm 47 years old. I work in telecommunications, satellite relay systems, and I have for about 20 years, which means I know more than most civilians about how signals behave, what they can do to equipment, and under certain circumstances, what sustained low-frequency exposure can do to the human nervous system. I'm telling you that last part up front because it's relevant. In March of 2020, right at the start of everything shutting down, My friend Gary Platt and I drove out to Death Valley for what we called a last hurrah before lockdown camping trip. Gary was a high school friend, one of those friendships that survives purely on the strength of history and mutual respect, despite very different lives. He was a contractor, divorced, lived in Bakersfield. We tried to do a trip once a year, had been doing it for over a decade. Death Valley had always been Gary's idea. He'd been obsessed with it since we were kids. Something about the extremity of it, the lowest point in North America, the hottest recorded surface temperature in the world, the visual scale that makes you feel geological. We'd done it twice before. We knew the rhythms of the place. We camped at Furnace Creek, drove out to the salt flats at Badwater Basin, did some hiking in the Panamint Range. First day and a half, completely normal. Great, actually. That particular March, Death Valley was experiencing a rare bloom year, and there were wildflowers pushing up through the desert floor in places where you'd expect nothing. Gary kept stopping to photograph them. He was in a genuinely good mood. The second evening, we drove out to a remote spot Gary had found on a satellite map, a dry lake bed about 22 miles from Furnace Creek, accessible by a graded road that the park technically permits but doesn't publicize. No facilities, no other campers, complete isolation. Gary had been there once before, years ago. He said the star visibility was extraordinary. We set up camp around 6 p.m., ate dinner, watched the sunset over the Amargosa Range. By 9 p.m., the stars were doing exactly what Gary had promised. At some point, I didn't note the exact time, I think it was around 10:30 or 11 p.m., I noticed something at the edge of my hearing. I want to be careful how I describe it because it's important to be accurate. It was not a sound in the normal sense. It was more like the memory of a sound, or a sound you're not sure you're hearing. A low, steady vibration, more felt than heard, at a frequency that my brain kept almost but not quite categorizing. I asked Gary if he heard it. He'd been lying on his back looking at the sky. He sat up, listened. "Yeah," he said. "I've heard that before. It does that out here sometimes." He lay back down. I pushed it because, again, telecommunications background, this is my professional area. I asked him to be specific. When had he heard it? How long did it last? Did it change pitch? He thought about it and said it had been there the last time he'd visited too, years ago. That it seemed to come and go. That he'd always assumed it was something geological, underground gas movement, tectonic microactivity, something like that. He didn't seem troubled by it. I wasn't troubled either at that point. But I was curious in the way that people in my field are curious when something behaves unexpectedly. We went to sleep around midnight. I slept adequately but not well, woke a few times with a low-grade headache that I attributed to dehydration and altitude adjustment. Though Death Valley is below sea level, so the altitude explanation didn't really hold up. Gary woke up irritable. I noticed it immediately. He's normally a morning routine and coffee and civil type. This was different. Short answers, barely responding to questions. He said he hadn't slept well either. I gave him space, made breakfast, figured he'd come around. By mid-morning, it was clear he hadn't come around. We drove out to do some hiking, and he was quiet in a way that felt less like contemplation and more like pressure, like he was containing something. I asked twice if he was okay. Both times he gave me a look that I recognized from arguments we'd had years ago, a look that said he was at the edge of his patience and didn't want to talk about it. Which was bizarre because we'd had a normal, good time the night before. Around 2 p.m. on the trail, he stopped walking. He said, "Do you hear that?" I listened. I couldn't hear anything specific. Wind, our own breathing, the crunch of salt crust under our boots. He said, "It's louder. It was there all night, and now it's louder." I asked him to describe what he was hearing. He seemed frustrated by the question, like I should already know. He said, "The hum. The low hum. You said you heard it." I had heard something the night before. Now, listening carefully, I thought maybe I could detect it at the very bottom edge of perception. Maybe. The kind of thing you can't confirm because consciousness affects the measurement. Gary stood there listening for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to camp. Here's where I want to be precise, because this next part is where my professional background becomes relevant. Infrasound. Sound frequencies below 20 Hz, below the human threshold of conscious hearing, is well documented in its effects on human behavior. Sustained infrasound exposure has been demonstrated in research settings to cause anxiety, unease, altered perceptions of presence, even visual disturbances. The mechanism is partly physical. Low frequencies resonate with the human body cavity and inner ear in ways that trigger stress responses. Certain geological formations are known to produce infrasound naturally, specifically volcanic rock structures, large underground caverns, and dry lakebed environments where wind behavior creates resonant chambers. I knew all of this. And somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, standing on a trail in Death Valley, watching Gary walk away with his jaw tight and his hands clenched, I put the pieces together. We had been camping on a dry lakebed. The infrasound, if that's what it was, had been present since at least 10:30 p.m. We had been awake in it for roughly 4 hours before sleeping in it for another 6 or 7. Infrasound exposure affects individuals differently based on biology, existing anxiety levels, sleep quality. Gary was already going through a difficult period. His divorce had been finalized the previous year. He'd had some work trouble. He wasn't sleeping well generally. I was alarmed. Not dramatically, but deliberately. I walked back to camp and told Gary I thought we should move to Furnace Creek for the night. I gave a neutral reason. Cell service, supplies, a change of scenery. He resisted briefly, said it seemed unnecessary, said he was fine. He didn't look fine. We drove to Furnace Creek. Over the next 3 hours, Gary gradually returned to himself. The irritability faded. He became conversational again. By dinner, he was almost entirely normal. He apologized for being off without being able to explain why. I didn't explain it either. I didn't want to. I wasn't completely certain, and telling someone they may have been affected by a sound they couldn't consciously hear is a strange conversation that I wasn't sure would help. We went home the next day. The lockdown started a week later. We didn't talk much for months, the way everyone didn't talk much for a while. I did my own research when I got back. The specific lakebed we'd camped on, I'm not going to name it, has a known geological feature approximately 200 feet below the surface, a collapsed cavern structure documented in USGS survey data. Under certain wind conditions, air movement over that topography creates resonant frequencies in the infrasound range. I found 2 academic papers tangentially addressing this. Neither was alarming. Both were dry, technical, entirely clinical. What I also found was a message board post from 2014 written by a different camper who had spent a night in approximately the same location. He described waking up with a severe headache and unusual paranoia. His companion, he wrote, had become convinced at around 3 a.m. that something was in the dark outside the tent and had refused to come out of their sleeping bag until sunrise. His companion had no history of anxiety disorders. I called Gary about 6 weeks into lockdown and gently described what I thought had happened: the infrasound, the resonant cavern, the documented effects on cognition and mood. There was a long silence. Then he said, "That explains the voice." I asked him, "What voice?" Another silence. Then, "I didn't tell you this. I thought it was a dream. But sometime in the night, I don't know what time, I thought I heard a voice coming from outside the tent. Not words, exactly, more like the shape of words, very low. I didn't go out to check." He waited, then he said, "I think I didn't go out because part of me didn't want to know who was there." I have 3 explanations for this, ranging from scientific to troubling. Infrasound auditory hallucination, hypnagogic sleep disruption vocalization, or an actual person or animal in proximity to our tent that neither of us investigated. The third explanation is the one I try not to think about. What I know is this: there are places in the American wilderness where the ground itself is producing frequencies that your body responds to before your brain registers them. Where the landscape is running a process below the threshold of your awareness, slowly adjusting your perception, your mood, your fear response. You can be sitting in the dark listening to something you can't quite hear, not understanding why you feel wrong. not understanding that the place you're sitting has been doing this for longer than you've been alive. Gary moved to Phoenix the following year. New job, new start. We still talk, but less than before. The last time I saw him in person, I almost brought up the voice again.
I wanted to ask if he remembered anything else about it. I decided against it. Some doors are better left with the questions still on the other side.
If you made it through all 3 of these, you already know what kind of person you are. The subscribe button is right there. It won't make the humming stop, but it'll make sure you don't miss what comes next.